Okay, so our topic is neighborhood poverty and child outcomes. I want to begin with what is the definition of neighborhood poverty and who does it affect directly? So, the Pew Research Center defines neighborhood poverty as the amount of households in poverty in a specific geographic tract. So, that could be a percentage of the population or it can be a distribution in a certain part of the city. Um, Neighborhood characteristics are linked to phenomena such as crime, health, and education. And so the question we want to look at is neighborhood poverty harming its community by itself? And when we say community, it's made up of many components. It's made up of adults, children, elderly, and other people. And we want to see, is it the neighborhood that's causing an effect on, in this presentation, specific childhood outcomes. So a quotation from a Federal Housing and Urban Development Department report said that the independent impacts of neighborhood poverty rates in encouraging negative outcomes for individuals like crime, school leaving, and duration of poverty spells appear to be nil unless the neighborhood exceeds about 20% poverty. Whereupon the externality effects grow rapidly until the neighborhood reaches approximately 40% poverty. Subsequent increases in the poverty population appear to have no marginal effect. So you see that that rapid growth once it reaches a certain poverty threshold in an environment. Moving along to the next slide, there's something called the 5 domains of childhood and adolescence affected by neighborhood characteristics. This was discovered in a journal article in the Journal of Research on Adolescence, where they identified 5 domains, the first one being physical health. So this goes into certain topics such as obesity, getting enough nutrients daily, having food to eat. The second one was sexual risk. This goes into early teen pregnancy, single parenting, and much more. Third was externalizing behavior. How are they letting their aggression go out? Strain. The fourth is internalizing behavior. This one was a key domain because research has started to show that poorer families from white backgrounds historically have dealt with things such as suicide, but now as research has gone on and you're seeing a lot of black families who are stuck in poverty, suicide is becoming prevalent in African American youth. And we want to look at our neighborhood characteristics, in relation to this, childhood internalizing behavior aspect in which it may lead someone to commit suicide. And the last one is academic development. Some key parts of this are, parenting, how much time is spent on homework, is there an education mediator, and family capital, family networking specifically, where a child has a family member to look up to in a positive way. If that's prevalent, it has shown that it can lead to a lot better childhood outcomes and future earnings. Next is issues in the DMV area. As you can see on some of the charts, you see the racial segregation on the right. It shows DC has been relatively unchanged over approximately 20 years in the mapping. And then you see the amount of poverty on the left bar chart. The Equality of Opportunity Project, the center, found that there's a strong negative correlation between racial and income segregation and relative economic mobility. What that means is, in highly segregated areas, you're going to see lower economic mobility and vice versa. And segregation is a key hindrance to a child's future economic mobility. And so what do the statistics say? On the left side, I included a chart that shows the earnings at age 30 by parental income. So you see people whose parents' income were in about the 99th percentile make a significantly higher amount of earnings at 30 compared to those whose parents were in the lower percentile. And then children in more stressful life experiences have a greater likelihood of suffering health problems. This just shows the ratio of those type of statistics.
Gentrification in Washington, D.C. According to the article, D.C. no longer the most intensely gentrified city in U.S., ranking behind San Francisco and others in new study. From 2000 to 2012, Washington, D.C. was the most intensely gentrified city in America, and that's from Ostermule. The same article does a study from the NCRC in which they looked at 1,346 neighborhoods that were able to be gentrified in DC, and quote, 41% of the neighborhoods that were eligible actually ended up gentrifying. That's from Ostermule as well. Therefore, from the years of 2000 and 2012, the city of DC was always changing, and still it remains high among the most gentrified cities in America, which has effects on children and families who live well below the poverty line and who live in really low income areas. One ways in which this can affect them is new housing policies and basically where the resources are going. So many public housing complexes in DC have been displaced, torn down, or just not taken care of. And this is often because of forms of gentrification and leaving certain people behind. These certain people are usually minority groups, in this case, African American. According to the article Washington, D.G., the District of Gentrification, quote, public housing residents also face unaddressed and unsafe conditions associated with pest infestations and leaking pipes, as well as humiliating forms of over-policing that criminalize young people's use of shared outdoor spaces, end quote, and that's from Prince. So as this quote says, because these housing policies are so poor and so oppressive towards certain groups of people, they can't feel safe inside because their housing complexes are not properly treated. You know, there's infestations, there's rats, there's pipe leaks, etc. And outside, you know, certain people have to be aware of the over policing and, you know, the oppression and stereotyping that is done outside through systems and through police force, etc. So if the disadvantaged groups of DC who are living in these housing complexes are not receiving proper resources, then where are they going? Well, that leads me to my next point. From my research, the city puts their resources into new condos, restaurants, and neighborhoods. Quote, Capitol Riverfront is one of DC's fastest growing neighborhoods with 14,000 residents expected by the end of 2019. It's also one of America's coolest neighborhoods, and that's from Mellendorf. So this quote here says it's one of America's coolest neighborhoods, but based upon my research, it's majority white. So that gets me to my next point. Gentrification and these housing policies are often looked at as being racially incentivized, and that's something I definitely agree with. According to the article, it's primary racial. Study finds DC has the most intense gentrification in the country. Quote, just across the river from the roaring crowd at Nats Park is Ward 8, where less than half of residents feel safe outside their home during the day. Over 90% of Ward 8 residents are African American, and that's from Mellendorf as well. So as you can see, there's less than a mile radius between these two groups. And however, the gap between resources and funds and proper treatment is way too high and just not fair. And that this is how gentrification can continue to sprout and push the privileged groups forward and leave behind those who are not privileged, like African American people. And this can have a major effect on children and families. With its history of gentrification, children and families have been deeply affected. In DC, housing complexes have been torn down, which leaves no other place for many families to go. According to the art, so actually, before I get to that next point, this kind of gets to what I was saying earlier. You know, a lot of these children have no other place to go. And even if they do have somewhere to go, you know, the environment which they live in is often just so poor and not something, you know, anyone in this class or community would deem normal or proper to be living in. And that can have an extended and plethora amount of effects on your mental, your physical, you know, your social life, etc. Basically your whole entire lifestyle and your future as well. And also, according to the article, Washington, D.C., the District of Gentrification, quote, decades of job and housing discrimination have fostered a segmented workforce, hindering the ability of all African Americans to accumulate wealth, quote, end quote. And that's from Prince as well. And so this kind of touches upon the cycle of which outgroups and minority groups are put in. In a prior African American studies class, one of my professors talked about how privilege and white people and white privilege and those with white power often like to pivot to remain to keep that power, and they use systems or individual works to do that. And I think this is just another way in which that can happen. Gentrification is pushing for better things for groups that already have better things, and they're leaving behind groups that don't. And I think that's just one of the major problems of DC and also our country as a whole.
I will be talking about neighborhood poverty and childhood outcome in Northern Virginia. Northern Virginia is located south and west of DC and differs vastly from the rest of Virginia. It is commonly known that this is a very wealthy area, so poverty isn't something that comes to mind when thinking of Nova. In fact, according to Daily News, 4 of the top 5 richest counties in the United States are within Northern Virginia. These are Loudoun County, Falls Church City, Fairfax County, and Arlington County. There are 3.1 million residents, and that is 37% of the entire state's population. Lastly, 320 of Virginia's public schools make up the top schools when compared with 24,000 other schools in the United States. I hope with this background information you guys get a good idea of the region we will be touching on. Although this is a wealthy area, there are many lower income neighborhoods that are tucked in between these higher income neighborhoods. In 2018, 71,172 people lived below the poverty line. That's a 6% poverty rate. Although a smaller percentage compared to the national average, it is noted that these neighborhoods are often overlooked because no one expects them to be there. 22% of those people lack health insurance. People in poverty often deal with more health issues because of the stress and hardships they go through. Not having access to health insurance is adding another expense to their lives that makes it harder for them to be successful. 73.1% of people who are above poverty are fully employed, whereas only 19.6% of people below the poverty line are fully employed. In fact, 39.9% of Northern Virginia residents who are in poverty are not in the workforce at all. It is commonly known that African American and Hispanic children face the highest poverty rates in America. Being in an area which is 55.41% white, I believe it's important to point out how majority of the people within these lower income neighborhoods are Black or Hispanic. Here on this image, we can see the differences between the two neighborhoods. Lake Barcroft, which is very well off compared to Bailey's Crossroads. What amazes me is how they are right next to each other. This creates an issue because people in the lower income neighborhoods, such as Bailey's Crossroads, are often stuck there due to the high housing prices around them. Within these neighborhoods, we can also see a clear difference in childhood outcomes through how many children are enrolled in each one. Almost none are enrolled into school at Bailey's Crossroads, and we can see that the childhood poverty percentage is at 34%, whereas it's only less than 0.01% in the neighboring area. Continuing, Asian and white people are often consuming these higher income neighborhoods, such as Brambleton, which is 46% Asian, leaving African Americans and Hispanics to lower income neighboring areas, such as Southern Towers Community in Arlington, which is 72% Black. To touch on children in poverty and their outcomes, let's start off by talking about how in Northern Virginia, 99% of children ages 3 to 4 attend preschool, which is an amazing percentage. But in 15 tracts, fewer than 0.01% of children were enrolled. Around a third of children in Northern Virginia lived in poverty, and Gainesville reported that 76% of their children lived in poverty. We can see the outcomes of this when adults fewer than 75% had completed their high school in 18 tracts of Northern Virginia. Affluent children in Northern Virginia tend to live 18 years more than poor children in their average life expectancy. When comparing Northern Virginia to the rest of the DMV, we can see that the numbers in Northern Virginia are much lower than both DC and Maryland. Maryland has 9.4% poverty rate and 553,000 people living below the poverty line. That's a much bigger number than Northern Virginia's 71,000. They also have 13.3% of children in poverty. DC has one of the highest poverty rates in the country at 18.6%. It comes after only Mississippi, Louisiana, and New Mexico, and is higher than the national average at 12.7%. They also have an extremely high number of children living in poverty, which is 26%. This number has been at a constant rate for around 30 years. This is shocking when compared to its neighboring state, Virginia, which has extremely low numbers. Although Northern Virginia is doing an amazing job at keeping its poverty rates low, I believe there should be more done for those who don't have a high chance at making it out of the lower income neighborhoods due to the wealth that surrounds them.
So today I'm going to be talking about poverty in Maryland. There's a total of 5,887,776 people in Maryland. And of that number of people, there's 573,383 people who live in poverty. 15.2% of African American Marylanders live below the poverty line. And also, one really big statistic is that 48% of those people who live in Maryland that live in poverty have incomes below 50% of the poverty line. So one way to really help people and alleviate neighborhood poverty is something called the Temporary Cash Assistance Program. So basically what this program is a program that helps the lowest income families somewhat get by according to Maryland's Department of Human Services. There are such requirements for being eligible for this program, such as meeting financial and technical requirements, participating in work activities. Also, earned and unearned income cannot exceed the benefit level paid for assistance unit size. Though the temporary cash assistance may help for a while, this is not something that will help in the long run. It will not last. The reason I say this is because the amount of assistance available remains far below the poverty line. It also is below the Maryland minimum living level. One other thing I would like to point out is childcare. Because the affordability of childcare in Maryland is very high. With parents living in poverty, they have to choose between their work and taking care of their children. So it's tough on parents. They can't be there for the kids, and they also have to take risk, and they're just afraid to send them to childcare because they might not believe it's a reliable source. Families that are living in the suburbs are paying similar childcare prices to those that live in Washington, D.C. Families with infants living either in Virginia and Maryland suburbs expect to pay between 11% and 15% of their median income on childcare alone. Because if you think about it, that's already taxes. You already take what was it, like 40 to 30% of your paycheck. Now your childcare is also in between 11% and 15%. You're not making any money, so it's really tough on these parents. And the number in Montgomery County is 13%. So this next slide is an image of basically the percentages of places in Maryland that take a lot from your median childcare takes a lot from your median income. Howard County is 12%, Anne Arundel County is also 12%, PG County is 13%, Loudoun County is 13%, Fairfax County is 13%, District of Columbia, DC is 14%, and Alexandria City happens to be 15%.
For my conclusion, I wanted to discuss neighborhood poverty and childhood outcome in general terms. So data has shown us that children of color are significantly more likely to live in disadvantaged communities. Black and Native American students are 7 times more likely to live in concentrated poverty than white students, as you can see depicted in this bar chart. So the effects of clustering low-income families and neighborhoods that don't have many resources increase the likelihood that children will be exposed to violence, less likely to have access to libraries, green spaces, clinics, and other resources that support students outside of school. So a Stanford study found a Y-test score gap between Black and white students, which could be explained by many communities and school districts becoming segregated, isolating students even further and inhibiting them from having the same opportunities as others. And we kind of saw this in the documentaries that we watched at the beginning of the semester. So I wanted to show you this video by Raj Shetty because it discusses how data was found and used to trace the effects of neighborhoods on the life outcome of children who grew up in them. So in week 5 of this course, we actually saw a video of Raj Shetty, and I think I'm butchering his name. He's an economist and professor, and he explained the lasting effects of living outcomes when there isn't social mobility present. It becomes harder to move up the social mobility ladder when people live in highly segregated areas and have high income inequality. So in the end, all these factors affect children in many ways, such as in their health, behavior, and academic development.
I think we all ultimately want the same thing for our children. That is a shot at the American dream. It's the idea that no matter where you started in life, you have a shot of climbing up and achieving success. I think it's the central idea that draws immigrants like myself to come to this country. My parents grew up in very low-income families in India. America was a place that transformed their lives. And through my own personal experience, I've seen how the effects of that have cascaded across the generations. But if we look today, despite the fact that the American economy is one of the strongest economies in the world, children today, especially children who grow up in lower income families, don't have very good odds of going on to achieve a higher standard of living than their parents. And so I went on to become an economist to try to understand why these differences were emerging. So in order to study issues of equality of opportunity, you fundamentally need data that allows you to follow people across generations. Big data. That has proven to be extremely difficult in social science. But a critical breakthrough came in 2010 when my colleagues at Harvard and I gained access to anonymized tax, census, and social security records, information from the government that would allow us to map the roots of poverty and inequality in our society. We realized that we had really struck upon a gold mine of information. As we began to spend more time with the data, the thing that we were amazed to see was that the roots of economic opportunity lie at a very local neighborhood level. Specifically, we found that there were high opportunity neighborhoods where we see kids go on to have high rates of college attendance, high levels of earnings. Then going down to the low opportunity neighborhoods, there were big differences in terms of children's outcomes. Digging further, we looked at families that moved across places, and we found that moving to a higher opportunity place earlier on in your childhood dramatically improves your life outcomes. And so these data show the geography of upward mobility across the United States. And I realized this could really change the course of lives in America.
My name is Nikki Manlapas, and I am a single mother to my 3-year-old son, Theo, in Seattle, Washington. Shortly after Theo was born, we were living with my cousin, and my immediate concern was the area itself. It was not ideal for raising a child. There were not so many parks or playgrounds or preschools. That was very hard.
I think we want to be a country that has opportunity for everyone. And I think oftentimes there's the assumption that more expensive neighborhoods are just better, but what we see with the data is that that isn't always the case. We're seeing neighborhoods that might be relatively poor, but actually have really good neighborhood cohesion, where low-income kids actually do really well. And so what we did was start working directly with the housing authority in Seattle and King County, where some families have access to housing choice vouchers. But what we see is that low-income families who use vouchers oftentimes end up in high poverty neighborhoods with low opportunity for the kids who grow up there. And so we're bringing the data to the table and using housing counselors, help recruiting landlords, additional housing services to make sure that families actually have access to these areas and these opportunities.
I found out about the Seattle Housing Voucher Program. After I got my voucher, there was a program, CMTO, Creating Moves to Opportunity. They gave me a tour of the areas they were concentrating on. We saw parks, playgrounds, schools. It was a great way to see the neighborhoods that had the best opportunities for raising families. This is my little casa.
Okay, you color?
Having our own place feels really good. There's quite a few daycare centers around here. I know there's a good elementary school just up the street. I mean, I love this area.
What we're finding from this experiment is truly amazing. Some of the biggest impacts I've ever seen as a social scientist. Had Nikki stayed in the neighborhood where she lived before, our data showed that Theo's prospects would be dramatically lower than what they are now. Of course, you can't move everyone out of low opportunity areas to higher opportunity areas, but by using modern data, we can systematically study which types of places appear to produce better outcomes for kids, and we can learn lessons about how we replicate those environments in lower opportunity areas and give many more children from low-income families opportunities to succeed. And so the beauty of this research, what I find inspiring about it, is that it points to real solutions that can change people's lives.
I've always wanted Theo to have a great education, and because of this program, I really do feel good about his future. Now, he has opportunities that I never dreamed I could give him.
So we do have a long way to go to solve neighborhood poverty, but admitting there is a problem and finding some solutions to mitigate this and give better opportunities to these children is definitely a start, in my opinion.